On behalf of the East Wall History Group and the Dublin Port Company, I would like to welcome all the attendees to the first in a series of talks under the title, A Most Distressful Country, War of Independence, Dublin Port and the Inner City. This series of lectures is being presented to mark the centenary of the battle that took place at the London and North Western Railway Hotel on the 11th of April in 1921, just over a century ago, on North Wall. A century ago, Ireland was in the throes of the War of Independence. There would be a truce later on in the year, but at this stage of the year, that wasn't immediately obvious how close it was to coming to an end. Dublin was in turmoil. It was an important battleground in the war. And with Dublin Port being such an essential part of the city, part of the infrastructure, Dublin Port was caught up in the events. So over the next 5 weeks, between tonight and the 20th of May, there'll be 5 talks on various topics relating to the War of Independence. It will centre on Dublin, and there'll be a specific focus on Dublin Port and the surrounding areas. There'll be a talk on IRA activity in the South Docks. We'll come north of the river then to have a talk on activities of the Republican forces in the North Docks, in the area immediately adjacent to Dublin Port. There will be a talk on Crown Forces deployment and activities in Dublin, and I think we'll be wrapping up with a look at IRA casualties in Dublin City during the War of Independence. And to kick off tonight, we have Brian Hanley. It's important to say over the next 5 weeks, you have to book all the talks. Tonight's talk has been booked out for the past couple of days, and I know there's a lot of people who can't get on. So if you're interested in the rest of the talks, please make sure you book them. Brian, for anyone to run an insurgency, one thing you need is weapons. And during the War of Independence, going up against a better equipped foe, the Republican forces needed a source of weaponry. They needed to make international contacts, and they needed to find a safe location to bring this material into the country and to get other things out of the country. And where better than Dublin Port in the capital? And that's what Brian is going to talk about tonight. For people who don't know who Brian is, I'd be very surprised to know there's very many here who don't. Brian is one of the leading historians of the Irish Revolution in the 20th century. He's an assistant professor of 20th century Irish history at Trinity College Dublin. He's the author of several books and articles on Irish republicanism, and his current research is into the global impact of the Irish struggle for independence. His books include The IRA, 1926 to 36, Groundbreaking, The Lost Revolution, the story of the official IRA and the Workers' Party, and most recently, I hope I'm correct in this, Brian, The Impact of the Troubles on the Republic of Ireland, 1968 to 79, Boiling Volcano. And of course, also numerous articles and pamphlets on the subject. So without further ado, on behalf of the East Wall History Group and the Dublin Port Company, I'd like to start off this lecture series by passing it over to Brian Hanley for his talk. And afterwards, there'll be plenty of time for a Q&A. Off you go, Brian.
Thanks very much, Joe, for that very generous introduction. And thanks to the Dublin Port Company and to the East Wall History Group for the opportunity to speak tonight. I should emphasise at the start that I'm indebted to all the people who've been working on this area and bringing to light previously little known aspects of our revolution. These include Joe himself and East Wall History Group, Liz Gillis, Liverpool historian John Belsham, Bruce Nelson and Gerard Noonan, who've all written on different aspects of the story that I'm going to try and tell tonight. And also to Cecile Kim In and Sam McGrath and the staff at Military Archives, whose work is making it possible really to examine many of these new areas of the revolution. And one thing I'm keen to do, I suppose, is to, if I can get my slide to work, is to emphasize that I want to look often at the experiences of those who took part in the War of Independence, but who didn't engage in armed activity. We sometimes forget that the War of Independence involved a mass popular movement against British rule. And even though I'm going to be speaking about gun running, most of those who engaged in that activity didn't actually use weapons themselves. The movement for independence included scenes like this from Mount Joye during the hunger strikes of April 1920, where thousands of ordinary Dubliners are confronting the British Army and tanks and so on. And you had election campaigns, Dáil courts, foundation of Republican police, strikes, boycotts, and so on, all part of that movement. And part of that story is also a network of men and women, mainly working class, often dock workers and seafarers, including what might be described as a few colourful characters, who made up a network that extended from Dublin and Liverpool to Hamburg, Antwerp, Genoa, New York, Montreal, London, and Glasgow. And I will, as I go along, move quite a bit from Dublin, but I hopefully come back to the port in the end. Now, I'm stressing, of course, that in many cases people did not play a role in the armed movement, but nevertheless, this isn't to ignore that by 1921, when over 1,000 people were killed in the first 6 months, the armed struggle was increasingly to the fore. Martial law and curfews in effect over much of the country, executions now happening regularly, over 5,000 men interned. And it was the IRA's war which had put the question of independence at the centre of the world's attention. Though we know now, as Joe mentioned at the beginning, that the conflict had actually entered an endgame by 1921, most people at the time had no idea that the war was going to come to an end. For ordinary people, things just seemed to be getting worse. And for the players on both sides, there was a steep learning curve. And there in the photograph, you see on the one hand, again, mass mobilization as people pray outside Mount Joye prison before executions, but you also then see the unromantic side of the armed struggle. That's British soldiers who were killed actually just before the truce in Cork. And you also see the scenes from outside the Custom House in May 1921, which again, the East Wall group and others are going to be discussing, no doubt. Most people didn't realise that this was all going to stop. For them, the war seemed to be getting worse. But again, important to emphasise, even then, most people, even those who supported the IRA, couldn't really play an actual hands-on part, even if they wanted to. And that was simply because they didn't have the weapons. Excuse me. The simple reason, as I said, was that there's now an estimate that the IRA at its height had over 100,000 men on its volunteer rolls, on paper at least. That's not even counting Cumann na mBan or na Fianna and so on. Now in mid-1921, according to the IRA's own estimates, it possessed just over 3,000 rifles of various types, maybe 5,000 handguns, and around 60 machine guns. It also had about 15,000 shotguns, which tend not to appear in any of the publicity photographs, but which were far more common than rifles or anything else. Now, these figures are probably inexact, as some units didn't tell the whole story to HQ, but quite clearly the IRA was underarmed. And obtaining arms was an obsession for most units. Right up till the end of the war, success was often counted by a unit on the number of rifles or other weapons that it captured from the British forces or from the police and so on. It was also an excuse for some units to explain their inactivity, to argue that they didn't really have weapons, so there was very little they could do. Local IRA units were never really happy with the level of armament that they were supplied, and there were continual rows with GHQ in Dublin about whether or not they should send more weapons to the countryside. So a lot of the photographs you see of IRA flying columns and so on, they're on the right. That's Connemara in the west of Ireland in 1921. And they're lined up essentially to make it look like they are pretty heavily armed with sidearms and with rifles and so on. But on the left, there's a photograph from Ballybay in Monaghan. And you can actually see, if you look at closely, that they've got a real variety of weapons, including some very old looking carbines, probably a couple of RIC carbines as well, and maybe one or two Lee Enfields. And again, the problem is, if people are aware of military tactics and so on, that a mixture of weapons is actually a bad thing to have, because there's then problems with obtaining ammunition, problems with swapping ammunition, and essentially an army wants to have a single weapon that every soldier can be trained on and is used to, and that's then readily replaceable and has plenty of ammunition. And the IRA certainly didn't have that. So how to get that was a major problem. And in 1921, Sean McMahon, who was the IRA's Quartermaster General, originally from York Street in Dublin, explained the problem at length, and I'll read some of it out. And he said, it wasn't buying weapons that was the problem. He says the purchase of arms is a simple matter compared with our transport difficulties. The removal of material from point to point on land and sea until it reaches this country. The difficulty in landing, storing and distributing materials in the country cannot be grasped by the average man, even in the army, but can only be realised by those who have to overcome the difficulties. Take, for example, he said, the purchase of 100 weapons and see what it means to have them delivered here in Ireland with safety. Firstly, the clearance from a foreign port where you have enemy agents always on the alert. Then the arrival at an Irish port where you have an even closer net to get through, where every boat is carefully searched immediately on arrival. When you have them landed and distributed, what does it amount to? Merely 2 weapons per brigade. It's a tough job to get 100 weapons, but it looks nothing when the brigade gets its share. And the brigade officer will always look at it from the 2 weapons point of view, i.e. as it appears in the brigade. So McMahon is giving the leadership's point of view essentially and how difficult it is in the first place to get modern weaponry to Ireland. And then once it's distributed, it doesn't look like very much at all. And this is of course one reason why in the early stages of the war, a major part of the IRA's activity was taking weapons from the police or the British Army if they could. But ultimately, as the war went on, that became more difficult and as the British became more professionalised and so on too. So by 1921, across the country, local units were increasingly seeking arms independently of headquarters in Britain and elsewhere, which complicated matters, to put it mildly, and I'm not going to talk about it much, but it meant that they were men from Mayo and Cork and elsewhere in Britain looking for guns without the authorisation of Dublin. And sometimes they were crisscrossing each other in terms of trying to get these weapons. There was also a major row at leadership level about finance during 1920 between Cathal Brugha, the Minister for Defence, and Michael Collins, which actually stopped purchases of weapons for a period. This again alienated local units who began to raise their own funds to buy weapons. Mayo IRA man Richard Walsh then pointed out some of the difficulties that occurred once you went to somewhere like Britain and attempted to buy arms. He said there were men whose activities gave rise to grave suspicion, as large sums of money were unaccounted for in places like Manchester and Glasgow. And that undoubtedly, and he also said, undoubtedly a large sum of money allotted for the purchase of arms in Britain was unaccounted for, about £10,000 to £12,000 approximately, which is a lot of money at the time. And it's not the only money that the IRA lose in this period when they try to get weapons. So buying weapons one thing, getting them to Ireland was another. And it was also the case, as McMahon pointed out, that the British weren't going to let you get these weapons to Ireland if they could. So by 1921, John Archie Kennedy a unit of black and tans had been formed. And he said this unit was composed of naval cadets, engineers, firemen, sailors and revenue officers. They were a Q company and they were stationed in the London North Western Railway Hotel at the North Wall. Their duty consisted of patrolling the docks day and night, boarding and searching all ships in arrival in port, and so on. Now, of course, people will be familiar if they've followed the work of the East Wall History Group with the centenary of the attack on the auxiliaries Q company in the London North Western Railway Hotel, which is the photograph in the middle there. But also at this time, a man called Ormond Winter, as you can see him straight out of central casting there as the villain, was the head of British intelligence in Dublin Castle. Now, he claimed afterwards that they were trained agents on most of the boats coming from Dublin and Kingstown, and that men were placed successfully in most of the steamship companies trading with Dublin. So the British certainly also had other agents working in Dockland, as well as the uniformed men of the auxiliaries Q company. Again, there's a page from the Hue and Cry, which is the police gazette there, which includes photographs of people like Michael Collins and Richard Mulcahy. The only reason I've put it there is because sometimes people will tell you that the British didn't know what Michael Collins looked like. Well, the photograph of him from the first stall was, as you can imagine, pretty useful to the British. So there's an intelligence war going on. And again, there's a learning curve. By 1921, both sides have learned lessons, but the British are certainly professionalising their operation in Ireland, and that affects arms supplies too. Richard Mulcahy, the IRA's chief of staff, later lamented that while at home our people are much more reticent and guarded in their statements, in America our people are talkative. For instance, the British Secret Service made much greater headway against our organisation in America than they did in Ireland. And think I'll come back to that later on too, because I think it has a bearing on arms supply from the United States. But certainly the intelligence war also takes place in Britain, and it takes place in the US as well. And much of it takes place around dockland areas and around ports. Just to give you an idea of how far the IRA's intelligence extended, though, there were people working in customs and excise in St. John's and Montreal in Canada. And in 1921, they spotted Bowen Colthurst, the British officer who'd murdered Francis G. Skeffington in 1916, arriving in Montreal. An IRA man had actually talked to him on board the ship he was travelling on, alerted the customs and excise agents who were also IRA supporters, and they reported back to Dublin that Bowen Colthurst had arrived in Canada, which is where he ultimately made his home. So again, everybody is professionalising, and the sea plays a big part in that. Now, John Archie Kennedy had been speaking in the context of the establishment of the IRA's Q Company in 1921. In 1938, there's a meeting of the old IRA in Dublin, and Gerard Shannon pointed this out to me. And that meeting heard the claim that one could not help feel that if the operations of Q Company were chronicled, they would put the best thrillers in the shade. And John Kennedy later identified the 1913 lockout, actually, as when a number of dock workers had begun to smuggle material through the port for the Citizens' Army. And he then explained how during 1919, GHQ realised that if these men were properly organised, they could obtain as much arms and munitions as the funds at their disposal could purchase. And he was then instructed to form a special unit and get in touch with dockers and keymen, seamen and firemen who were sailing to different parts of the world. And he later identified 41 dockers, stevedores and keymen based in Dublin, and 58 seafarers on various cross-channel boats as being part of Q Company. He described how the carrying of the stuff across thickly populated areas and cities, sometimes the distance so long and the stuff so heavy, it would be nigh impossible to walk. He talked about how for those active, it was a lonely walk to the docks, which in most parts were surrounded by high walls, lighted by electronic lamps, and guarded by uniformed police whom you can see, and shadowed by the CID who you can't. It will be understood that getting stuff aboard ships and transporting it took some doing. Even then, this work was not finished, as precautions had to be taken to guard against spies or hostile members of the crew. And supplies were arriving ultimately in such large quantities that I had to have my keymen on duty 24 hours a day, as time, tide, and bad weather plays all sorts of tricks with the arrival of ships. Some would arrive before time and over again be hours late. So this is really the work that Q Company was set up to do, to arm the IRA. And in real terms, the majority of stuff was arriving through Dublin. Now, I'll mention Cork in a while, and there was also Newry, Dundalk, Drogheda, and so on. But really, Dublin was the centre because Dublin was connected to Liverpool, and Liverpool was a very, very significant port for the IRA. But Q Company itself was only formally set up in the spring of 1921. And as Kennedy mentioned, many of its members had been engaged in smuggling prior to this. In fact, in 1919, the Citizens' Army had raided a US naval vessel at Dublin docks and stolen armaments then. But you're not just talking about guns, but also the movement of money, communications in particular, and also sometimes the movement of people. And you've got a wide variety of people involved in this Republican network. Citizens' Army veterans, both men and women, people who were moving back and forward between Britain and Ireland who are maybe formally members of any Republican organisation and so on. So you've got people like Christina Caffrey, it's her wedding photograph there again, the East Wall History Group are the people who've put this up. After the Easter Rising, which she took part in, she went to Glasgow. There she worked with Cumann na Món, and she started bringing back explosives from Scotland, which were again coming from Irish sympathisers in the mining areas of Lanarkshire around every 2 or 3 months. She also began to bring revolvers on occasion, and she deposited them with Citizens' Army officers at Liberty Hall. Moira Kennedy O'Brien, in contrast, was tasked by Volunteer HQ with collecting money. And she said most of the money in question, as far as I can remember, came from America, brought in by friendly members of ships' crews. I got a letter from Mick Collins' headquarters to call. I did so, and there was a large sum of money, £10,000 given to me. The money was in packets of crisp new notes. I disposed of them around my body under my clothes. At every movement I made, I thought everybody could hear the crackling of the notes. Then you also have Peggy Doyle, who took stuff off the boats and delivered it on several occasions to the 4th Battalion in Inchicore, and also brought stuff to Fleming's Hotel, which was being used by the IRA. Now, she travelled back and forth to Liverpool on several occasions on her own, and each time she brought back about 4 revolvers and as much ammunition as she could carry. And those stories are replicated hundreds of times, involving, as I say, a lot of men and women. But what you'll notice, usually, particularly when it comes to weapons, is that you're talking about relatively small numbers of arms and ammunition, mostly what people could bring in hand luggage and so on. So the majority of the IRA's smuggling during the War of Independence was relatively small scale. And I'll come back to that later on. And a key port and a key connection to Dublin was Liverpool, a city with long-standing links to Ireland and important for a whole series of reasons. Firstly, Liverpool in this era was considered the New York of Europe, a worldwide city rather than a British provincial one. It was the floodgate from the old to the new world. So of the over 5.5 million Europeans, for example, who emigrated in the late 1800s, almost 5 million of them travelled through Liverpool. So people from across Europe, not just from Ireland, often use Liverpool as the kick-off point for the transatlantic voyage to New York. There was also then very strong connections to Ireland through historic emigration and so on. Here's what Joseph Bannister, who was a racist bigot, to put it mildly, said about Liverpool. He said, Liverpool has for many years been employed as a dumping ground for the Irish Aborigines, whom the United States or our own colonies refuse to accept. Swarms not only of paupers and jailbirds from Sinn Féin land are unloaded there, but also young, pregnant, unmarried women. As a result, it is the most Irish, slummy, Romish, criminal and vicious city in England. Now, again, it was also a very divided city, and I'll talk about that too, maybe later on. But certainly it was a city with a very large Irish population, a very large immigrant Irish population, and a Republican organisation going back to the 1860s. So Dr. Patrick Daly, who became the commander of the IRA in Liverpool in late 1920, he's not to be confused with Paddy Daly of the Dublin squad. Dr. Patrick Daly was actually a Trinity graduate who came to Liverpool in 1918. He explained the significance of the city in several ways. One, he said, on account of its great port, it was the most important city in England for the underground organisation. Almost all the munitions in the other great cities like Manchester, Newcastle, Birmingham and Glasgow passed through it. In connection with the following seaports like New York, Hamburg, Antwerp, there were Irish sailors on board British vessels plying between these ports and Liverpool. They were organised to bring back munitions on their return journeys. And apart from the purchase of munitions, Liverpool was the most important port for communications between Dublin, America, and the continent. The liners plying between Liverpool and New York, especially the White Star and the Cunard boats, had Irishmen aboard who were employed to take dispatches from Liverpool for New York and vice versa. The sailors also engaged in the stowing away of leaders who wished to avoid arrest. So Liverpool and its connection to Dublin was absolutely crucial. And from then, particularly its connection to New York, but also to European ports too. And Daly explained that when weapons were collected, they remained in dumps until a boat was due to leave for Dublin or some other Irish port. Now, John Kennedy made the point that the ships travelling between Dublin and Liverpool might include Guinness boats, they might include the B&I line, a variety of shipping, not the major ocean-going liners which were leaving from Liverpool to New York, for example. But when weapons were collected, they were left in dumps in port areas. As Daly said, behind the 7 miles of docks which frontier the city along the Mersey lived a considerable number of the poorer section of the Irish population. These dumps were then in the houses of sympathetic Irish people who were all working class people. They were the only people who would take a risk over there. For Daly, the most essential member of our organisation was the Irish sailor. Scarcely a boat left Liverpool for an Irish, continental or American port which had not on board 1 or 2 Irishmen who were eager to do their part. Men working on the transatlantic boats also received payment for any risk they took, even though they were Irishmen. The payment was not, however, in proportion to the risks taken. And again, there's a much broader network on Merseyside and beyond, in places like St. Helens, for example, of both men and women involved in this work. Some were part of the Irish Republican Brotherhood, some were not. You've got individuals like Neil Kerr, who was the central figure in the IRA on Merseyside until November 1920 when he's jailed. Stevie Lanigan, who was an officer in the Customs Excise in Liverpool, an IRB activist. And women like Mary English, who owned a sweet shop in Bootle and whose premises served as a clearing station for arms from across England. Now, there was, of course, an irony in terms of the IRA's operations in England, is that once the IRA became more militarily active by the winter of 1920 and began to burn down warehouses on Liverpool docks and so on and carry out actions elsewhere, that it drew much more police attention, and actually smuggling became far more difficult. So some of the gun runners were unhappy with more militant action in Britain because it made gun running far more difficult. Nevertheless, it's part of the story as well. In June 1921, the New York Tribune claimed that an Irish activist in that city had told them that there were 2 submarines flying the Irish flag that maintained a regular passenger service for officials of the Irish Republic between Ireland and America. Indeed, the speaker claimed that De Valera had reached America on board a submarine and returned to Ireland in the same manner. Now, I'm not quite sure how a submarine would fly the Irish flag, obviously not when it's underwater. But of course, this wasn't true, although the IRA did indeed try to buy a submarine in Germany during this period. But in fact, De Valera, of course, and Harry Boland and Patrick McCartan and Liam Mellows and many other less well-known Republican activists crossed the Atlantic from Liverpool under false identities on board ocean liners, usually working their way as stokers or firemen on board the Cunard or White Star lines. Indeed, Harry Boland was to claim that the man who represents Ireland must be capable of fatigue and hardship. He must be able to spend 8 to 10 days at a time in the hellholes of the great American liners. Now, in fact, in Boland's case, he was not really equipped at all for the physical effort that work in the hold of these ships entailed, and it nearly killed him. But one of the sailors involved in transporting De Valera across the Atlantic gave an account of what this involved. And initially, De Valera was placed in the hold where his food was eaten by rats and where he had a fairly uncomfortable time. But ultimately, the Sinn Féin leader was fixed up with a space in the lamp trimmer's room. And it was a nice little clean room where we'd fitted up a special bunk there for him. The lamp trimmer, again, along with firemen and stokers as part of the work on board the whole of the ship. The lamp trimmer was a gentleman whom we shall call the Arab. The Arab was a somewhat lawless type of man. Except for the fact that he was born in San Francisco, he knew nothing of his parents, where they came from or where they went. And he had just grown up as best he could, or worst he could, from infancy. It would not be exaggerated to say that he cared for neither God nor man. One thing he liked, however, and that was to see the police get the worst of it always. Knowing this, I told him that the chief, that's De Valera, was a cousin of mine who had killed 2 policemen in Ireland and that he was wanted for it. When the Arab heard this, he said, if he shot a couple of policemen, he has my sympathy. And from then on, the chief had the Arab on his side. The Arab took a great liking to the chief. He used to tell the chief about all the cops he got the stranglehold on, and he never tired of asking the chief for details about how he shot the 2 cops. The chief was very much amused at him. Of course, the journey took maybe 8 to 10 days and so on, and that's how De Valera, who's there with Boland, receiving adulation in New York during 1919, got to the United States, and also how he got back. De Valera was broken out of prison in Britain, came back to Ireland, then went back to Liverpool, stayed in Aintree for a couple of days until his transport was organised, and then went to the United States in the hold of an ocean liner. And again, this was a very important part of communications between Republicans in Ireland and the United States and elsewhere. So Liverpool was obviously very important. As we've seen, the numbers arriving in Ireland still was relatively small. But post-war Europe was racked by armed conflict. In fact, there's an estimate that between 1918 and 1923, from when the war had officially ended up till the mid-1920s, around 5 million people died in conflict in Europe and the Near East. So the continent is not at peace, and weapons are to be found there in plenty places. Republicans then hoped to utilise a variety of contacts for diplomatic, political and material aid. And so the IRA's maritime network eventually extends to Russia, to Italy, to Belgium, Germany, and so on. And there are hopes at this point to try and solve the arms problem in one fell swoop, to actually bring in these large shipments of weapons that the local units across the country were desperate to get by the late 1920 and early 1921. And one area where the IRA sought arms was in Italy. Italy, if people know their World War I history, came out of the war on the winning side, but very, very disappointed in terms of the territory that they were being given. And an adventurer, an Italian nationalist adventurer named Gabriele D'Annunzio, seized part of Croatia around the city of Fiume and essentially established an Italian puppet state there. This rogue state attracted adventurers from across the world, and it also attracted revolutionaries from Egypt and so on. Sean T. O'Kelly, who was working for the Irish Republic during the summer of 1920, advising him that there was the potential of receiving weapons from Fiume. Ultimately, discussions were conducted through a man called Donald Hales from the famous Cork Republican family, who was based in Genoa on the other side of the Italian coast, the port of Genoa, and Michael Lee, a marine engineer from Cork and vice commandant of the Cork No. 1 Brigade of the IRA, was sent to Italy to try and negotiate an arms shipment. Ultimately, the Munster IRA, because they were going to go to Cork, especially, expected a shipment of 20,000 rifles, 500 machine guns, and several million rounds of ammunition in the spring of 1921. And they made arrangements for this to be landed in Cork or in Waterford. And this was to come through contact with Italian nationalists. However, the idea was abandoned in May 1921 after some discussion at IRA GHQ, and it caused much recrimination and was raised again and again during the disputes over the treaty and so on about why the IRA leadership had decided not in the end to try and get these arms. They obviously, again, would have had to come by ship, and it meant, of course, that the IRA were dealing with a variety of people along the Italian and indeed the Croatian coast. Another potential area for weapons was quite obvious. There were contacts with the new Soviet Union throughout this period. There was real popular enthusiasm for the Bolsheviks in Ireland, particularly after Britain became one of the powers that was intent on crushing them. As early as 1917, there was a meeting in Connaught Street in Phibsborough in Dublin at the home of a man called Seamus O'Doherty, who was an IRB man. And there Patrick McCartan was told that he should make his way to Russia to talk to what was then the Kerensky regime about support for Ireland. Ultimately, McCartan didn't get there until 1921. By then, the Bolsheviks were in charge. And he was the key man in dealing with the Bolsheviks, mainly through New York. And he again hoped that the Russians might supply 20,000 rifles at least to the IRA. But again, ultimately, he didn't get there until 1921, by which point the British had captured secret communiques between Republicans and the Bolsheviks, which they published in the right-wing Morning Post to argue that the Irish Revolution was being funded by the Soviets. That was the wrong way around. Ultimately, it was the Irish who gave the Soviets money. £20,000 was given by McCartan and Harry Bullen to the Soviets in New York in exchange for what were supposed to be the Russian crown jewels, but turned out to be pretty dodgy jewelry. But in Russia, by the time McCartan got there, he found his most trusted contact had been arrested as a British spy, and that the Soviets were now more interested in a potential trade deal with Britain than in at least giving material support to the Irish Revolution. So McCartan had made his way from New York, again, across the sea, in a variety of disguises, only to find that he was to be disappointed in the Soviet Union itself. So again, another place that might have been a source of major arms shipments turns out to be a failure. Germany was a bit different. There was more success for the IRA there, where again they established front companies and also purchased at least two boats, the Hanna and the City of Dortmund, which were docked in Hamburg. Weimar Germany, post-war Germany, was a giant arms bazaar because under the terms of the Versailles Treaty, the German military was drastically scaled down. There was a huge amount of weaponry for sale. The IRA were offered flamethrowers and even submarines. But Seamus Robinson of the Tipperary IRA was very interested in the spring of 1921 in acquiring trench mortars, or Minenwerfer, as they were called in the German military. He was making the point that it was very difficult for the IRA to launch any kind of large-scale attacks on British barracks and so on across Ireland with the equipment that they had available to them. So he authorised a German mission independently of Dublin with the help of Roddy Connolly, who was supposed to enlist communist aid in Germany, and also two ex-Trinity students and former British officers, Sean and Billy Beaumont, who could speak German and were thought to be helpful on this trip. Dubliner Bob Briscoe and Derryman Charlie McGuinness were already at work in Germany, sometimes for GHQ and sometimes for these other units. Briscoe had established a front company, a textile company, which gave him some cover for his work between Germany and Ireland. And they were dealing with ex-German officers, paramilitaries and arms dealers in Hamburg and Berlin. At one point, German sailors were actually housed in Dublin by Republicans, and they caused consternation for Richard Mulcahy when he spotted them at a play in the Gaiety Theatre. Meanwhile, Charles McGuinness, and that's him down in the left corner there, hardly kept a low profile in Germany itself. Sometimes it's hired in a Stetson hat. publicly with the representatives of the Republican movement and actually getting himself locked up for a period. Another irony was that Briscoe, that's him in the centre, was Jewish, but he was liaising with very right-wing German army officers. And also some of his Irish colleagues, such as Charles Bewley, the diplomat, were deeply hostile to him because of his religion and were trying to undermine him. But Billy Beaumont remembered of Charlie McGuinness that he was a most entertaining companion, but absolutely without scruple of any kind, financial or moral. On one occasion, he invited me to a well-known nightclub in Berlin. And when I demurred on the ground of expense, he tapped his breast pocket, which was bulging with Briscoe's money, and said, "That's all right, De Valera will pay for it." Now, given who they were dealing with in Germany, it was perhaps reasonable enough that McGuinness was a bit of a rogue, because certainly the IRA were dealing with all kinds of interesting characters. Indeed, in Hamburg alone, in the dockland around St. Pauli, they had a number of contacts, one of whom was described as a bit of a booze hound, type that would do any job if paid for it. There was also a man who went under the name Jack Newman, who was a sergeant in the Hamburg police working out of St. Pauli. But actually his real name was O'Toole. He was from Drumcondra. He'd served in the British Army in the First World War, being captured and joined Casement's Brigade. And like a number of Casement's Brigade, had actually stayed on in Germany in the post-war period. So he actually was a good contact to have on the Hamburg docks. So weapons were purchased along with a couple of boats. Front companies were established. But at the same time, around 7 million marks was lost in very confusing circumstances. Many of the weapons purchased were still in German warehouses into the mid-1920s and never got to Ireland. Both Briscoe and McGuinness faced questions about this, and they were inconclusive IRA inquiries into what had happened. The conclusion does seem to have been that they were ripped off by the Germans that they were dealing with. But 2 shipments did reach Ireland, both being landed in Waterford during the truce, though not of trench mortars or machine guns. And many of these rifles actually went north to arm the IRA during its offensive there in 1922. Contemporary dealings in Antwerp and Belgium were also unsatisfactory, with light artillery and rifles actually being purchased and then left there and finally being sold at a loss in the mid-1920s. An IRA report from the period after the Civil War complained that it was on this occasion that the director of purchases left a young lady he had brought over to put him in touch with these people stranded in Antwerp until she was able to obtain her fare home from her relations in England. So a lot of the IRA's work on the continent, again, doesn't succeed really in bringing in the arms in the numbers which they desire, and also obviously brings them into contact with a lot of unreliable people. This is obviously a photograph of IRA volunteers with the famous Thompson guns, and the IRA had high hopes for this in 1921. They expected a very large consignment of Thompson machine guns from the United States. Cut a long story short, Harry Boland had convinced IRA headquarters that large-scale investment was worthwhile in purchasing this weapon in bulk, and the IRA were the first bulk buyers of the Thompson. Ultimately, more than $120,000 was deposited in banks in Washington and was used to purchase these weapons. 2 former American officers came to Dublin to train IRA volunteers in the weapon. A small number were smuggled in on transatlantic liners from Liverpool and then brought to Dublin. And ultimately, the Thompson was first used in Dublin in an ambush on a troop train in Drumcondra in June 1921. There were still only a handful in the IRA's hands, however, and getting to Ireland proved to be a major problem. Boland had set up a front company in Manhattan called the Manhattan Oleo Agency, which is supposedly trading in large oil and oleo stock. And they were either going to be sent to Ireland to a company in Cork, or again sent to Liverpool and brought across to Dublin. But before that could happen, eventually almost 500 of the guns were captured on a ship called the East Side at Hoboken, New Jersey in June 1921. Ironically, on the same day on which they were used in Drumcondra. There was huge press attention given to the seizures and much speculation about their impact on the IRA. British intelligence was delighted. The British military had taken on board what the Thompson might do for the IRA's capabilities in urban and rural areas. They were delighted because they said this must have cost Sinn Féin a considerable amount of money, and they were very relieved that only a few of these weapons seemed to have reached the rebels. At the time, there was speculation in the New York Times that the capture of an IRA document in Dublin had actually given the game away. It's Harry Boland up there in the left, obviously, with Collins, and that's a contemporary ad for the Thompson in the United States, which seems to show it being used in the Wild West. But the New York Times essentially ran a story which speculated that IRA documents had been captured in Dublin, that the British had understood from these that Thompson guns were coming, and that the British had tipped off the American authorities. But rather than cause an international incident, what the British had done was essentially make it known that these weapons had been discovered accidentally by a sailor who'd fallen over a bag of Thompson guns, and then reported this to the police. That doesn't seem to have been the case. I think there probably was an intelligence failure on the part of the IRA. But it's interesting, and again, we owe the military pension files this knowledge. In the late 30s, several members of the crew of the East Side made claims for pensions, and they blamed a man called James McGee, who was a union official very heavily involved in the IRA's maritime work from Liverpool, Dublin, and the United States. And they blamed McGee for a series of mistakes, which they claimed had given away the shipment. And in very colourful language, a man called Larry Byrne from Enniscorthy or from Wexford argued in 1937 that I could not expect anything else from McGee, the dirty skunk. And if he thinks he can get away with this latest stunt, he is shit out of luck. The yellow son of a bitch was responsible for the loss of those guns. He bullshitted poor Harry, R.I.P., into the East Side deal when he could not get him to buy that old heap of junk, the steamship Teresa. We risked our lives to save those guns after his blundering. You remember how he told those fellas not to be seen talking to him after the failure. The dirty rat was afraid he would be pinched. You can tell that this man had spent quite a bit of time in the United States. But he said, I for one have had enough of park benches, hunger and cold and horse trucks, and I'm prepared to say your present illness is a result of the afterclaps of the East Side, and mainly due to McGee's influence with Harry. And essentially they argued that there was a strike taking place, which meant all sorts of complications with bringing a crew on board. Loyal, dedicated IRA members were on board. There was also crew members who were essentially scabbing on a strike, and that McGee made a whole series of mistakes which allowed the authorities to find out there were weapons on board and to seize them. But the seizure of nearly 500 Thompson guns certainly, I think, had an impact on the truce and on British calculations during the truce period, that a large shipment of weapons, which the IRA would have been very, very happy to get, did not arrive in Ireland at all. Now, my time is nearly up, so I'm going to conclude. This is Hoboken, New Jersey, and as I say, the British were very pleased. That's their account of it. But just to mention a couple of other things. This was an era of intense industrial turmoil and of working class militancy. And one feature of that is strikes at ports across the world. Now, this could be problematic for the IRA. Stevie Lanigan in Merseyside, for example, complained during 1920 that these damn strikes are going to upset all our arrangements. Because if ships are on strike and seafarers and dockers aren't working, then how are you supposed to smuggle arms? At the same time, you had many Irish activists who were involved in trade unions. And indeed, in April 1920, they attempted a strike in support of Irish Republican hunger strikers in Britain. And this was very divisive. Merseyside was a very divided city with a large loyalist population. The strike was not a success, but there are accounts of it in the witness statements and so on. And it's very interesting that on Merseyside, they felt confident enough to actually try and bring people out on strike in support of IRA hunger strikers in Britain. This is August 1920 with Irish Republican supporters on Merseyside gathering. They hope to greet Archbishop Mannix when he arrives in Merseyside. Of course, he didn't arrive there. He was arrested en route by the Royal Navy. And that was one of the factors which unleashed another part of the maritime story. And this is really something that I'd love to have seen commemorated last year, but it wasn't really because of the pandemic. In August 1920, the visit or the attempted visit of Archbishop Mannix to Ireland, the hunger strike of Terence MacSweeney, and also the influence of Irish workers in the maritime industry led to a strike on the Chelsea Pier on the west side of Manhattan, in Brooklyn and also in Boston against British shipping in protest at Britain's role in Ireland. And what's very interesting about this strike is that it initially involved, of course, Irish workers or Irish American workers, but in New York on the piers of Manhattan, Italians, Germans, and also African American workers took part in this strike. And some of them actually carried picket signs saying, if you scab Ireland, you scab the Negro race. And this was something, what was called the Irish Patriotic strike at the time, which I think was a really interesting part of our revolutionary history, and which the centenary of which took place last August, unfortunately wasn't commemorated probably in the way that it should. What I've tried to do is that give you a flavour at least of how important ports were and seafaring and dock workers were to the Irish Revolution, particularly their crucial role that Dublin Port played in this period and the way it linked with Liverpool and then to the rest of the world. So thank you very much for listening.
Just giving you a round of applause there, Brian. That was great.
Thank you.
We're just going to look in the chat here for, yeah, you're getting lots of love in the chat. You should check some of those out. Brian, if you could go back, I think it's about 2 slides. We had a question from Jim Kelleher.
Okay.
And he was asking if that was Seamus Robinson in the Eskimo snorkel. I think it's about one.
Oh, that was Charlie McGuinness.
Oh.
That's Charlie McGuinness, yeah, who a very fascinating character, and who did actually apply for a military service pension, but he also wrote a memoir in the 1930s, which is it's certainly worth reading if you can believe some of the things he says, but he certainly got up to some of the things he claims he did.
Lovely. Everyone loved the talk. If you have any closing points, another question that just came to mind from myself was, it seems like a lot of weapons weren't transferred. The deal was never completed. That was how a lot of the people did business, you know, with the Germans and the Irish. But a lot of times the weapons weren't completed within their transfer. So where did, for the weapons that did, that were transferred over to Ireland, what happened to them over time? I mean, when you said that the Irish tried to buy a submarine one time, I thought, what happened to that over time? You know, where is it now? How did we
they didn't get the submarine.
Yeah, no, not the submarine, but the rifles and stuff like that didn't go through. And it seemed like they were always, you know, being sold weapons to. So what happened to those weapons after kind of the war and some of the fights and things like that?
Well, most of them were used during the Civil War, and the IRA, as I mentioned earlier, there was a learning curve, and the War of Independence basically takes place over 2.5 years, which in historical terms is not that long. And the IRA were getting better at gun running. And they were, during the truce, in theory, during the truce, they weren't supposed to bring in any weapons, but they actually brought in far more. So they'd become better armed during the truce. Then there's the Civil War. And in the 1920s, there is still a lot of this equipment dumped across the country. And over the years, some of it's recovered and captured. Some of it is probably where it was dumped in 1923. The Thompson guns, because America being America, the IRA had purchased them in a legal fashion. They hadn't purchased them as the IRA. So though these weapons were seized by the Bureau of Investigation, which was the predecessor of the FBI, they were confiscated, but they weren't taken by the government. So in the mid-1920s, a man called Joseph McGarrity successfully got them back. And then for the next 10 years, the IRA was desperate to get them to Ireland, and eventually got some of them at least in the late 1930s. And then there's, in the National Museum in Collins Barracks, there is one of the original 1921 shipment on display there. So some of these weapons were lost forever. I don't know where these warehouses were, in Hamburg or Antwerp, but lots did arrive in Ireland. But I think the greater part of the story is that the big shipments never arrived. They never got that one-off major shipment, which would have made a huge difference. But you had hundreds of people, like Christina Caffrey and other people, who were bringing in small amounts all the time. And this was allowing them to punch over their weight, you know, in many ways.
Great, thank you for that. We had another question come through from Ado. Where did the funding come from for these attempted arms purchases?
Yeah, that's a good question. Now, some of it definitely came officially from Dáil Éireann. And I think that Harry Boland, the money Harry Boland had in the United States, was okayed. There was a row, as I say, at cabinet level between Colbrew and Michael Collins about money. Collins was a micromanager. I mean, in the Mulcahy papers in UCD, the stuff from Liverpool is the daily account of what's coming in. And he really did want everything accounted for. But I think Brewer was very suspicious of the IRB, very suspicious of who Collins was dealing with in Britain. So he tried to hold up the whole process. So at local level, you had arms levies where the IRA essentially asked their supporters for money, and sometimes people who didn't support them for money as well. That didn't raise a huge amount. And then by 1921, increasingly you have raids for money, which were a new phenomenon, and which GHQ are very anxious about. So some areas carried out robberies in order to try and pay for arms, and then they went off and tried to get them. So again, Sam McGrath originally alerted me to this, and it's been covered a bit since then. But in Britain, for example, you had Cork arriving with locally raised funds, and they end up dealing with criminals in London, or Kilkenny have contacts in London and they end up dealing with criminals and so on, or they're buying from demobilized British soldiers, or they're buying from sailors and so on too. So the money is raised in a whole variety of ways. Some of it is coming from the Dáil, and some of it's being raised locally.
Very informative. All right, we got another question here. How were the arms distributed to the country ASUs, and who decided the units?
Yeah, that's a big question, and it's one which causes all sorts of problems. When local units used to complain to Dublin that they couldn't do anything because they didn't have enough weapons, they'd often be told, well, then you just go out and get the weapons. You do it the way that everywhere else has done it, which is by taking them off the police or off the British Army. And that became increasingly hard to do. So you do have areas which were regarded as the most active areas, which kind of have first claim on weapons that come in. But it's never very satisfactory, and a lot of places are armed by their own efforts, really. You have to go back to 1914 with the Asgards to really see a major shipment for the volunteers, if you know what I mean. Everything else is pretty small scale, and there are continual recriminations between GHQ and the countryside about who has what, and whether Dublin is keeping a lot of material for itself. Again, in one of the photographs way back, you saw a grenade factory which were being set up in Dublin and in other parts of the country to try and make the IRA's own grenades. And they also began to use explosives far more by 1921, roadside mines and things like that, which they hadn't really done before. So again, there's this kind of learning curve, but it's never, the arming of the IRA is never very satisfactory in many ways, which again, when you look back at it, it's remarkable how much they achieved with what they had.
Absolutely in agreement there. Last question before we let everybody go. This is from Jim Kelleher again. Did Collins ever follow up on the alleged misappropriation of the arms fund?
Well, there was a couple of them, and I'm not aware of him directly following up on, say, what had happened in Britain. There is a big inquiry, which is long after Collins is gone, into what's happening in Germany with the money there, and the IRA never really comes to a satisfactory conclusion about that either. And again, it's once you get into the nitty-gritty of it, there is so much dealing with people on dockland areas across the globe and looking for information or looking for weapons and so on, that how they could keep an account, a very tight account of everything that was being spent, was obviously quite difficult. So I suspect more went missing than they were completely aware of. But in terms of what was being spent by Dublin in 1919, 1920, they were very keen to keep it as low as possible. And they're always complaining that, there's guns have been offered to Liverpool at a certain amount, and Collins is moaning that that's too much and that they should try and get them for less and so on. So they were kind of acutely aware of finance.
All right, thank you very much. Before we go here, Brian, if anyone wants to read more of your work or wants to get in touch with you somehow, where can they find that information?
Oh, well, I mean, my email is online, and it should be on the Trinity website as well. And I mean, I'm trying to work on the area of the global Irish Revolution at the moment, so I haven't published very much on it. But other people are publishing great stuff about it too. So look at the military service pensions blog, for example. There's always really good articles about the IRA in Britain and their contacts elsewhere across the globe if you want to find out more.